Grenada, in many ways a typical laid-back Caribbean hideaway. These days, tourism is what it's famous for. Few of the thousands of visitors that come to relax here will pay much attention to this spectacular island's relatively recent, complicated history. Robert Ross is an exception. Arriving here on vacation, he wasn't sure what to say when immigration asked him if he'd been to Grenada before. He had, but the last time he parachuted in onto the same runway now used by commercial jets.
I actually landed between those big double stripes and the next little smaller stripe.
Robert, a former Army Ranger, took part in the 1983 US invasion here. So what brought Robert and 7,000 US military personnel to this tiny island in the Caribbean? Why did this remote outpost briefly become the focus of the United States, Cuba, and the Cold War?
Long live friendship, solidarity and cooperation.
1979, Maurice Bishop, a British-educated lawyer, seized power in Grenada as the leader of a popular leftist uprising. He declares himself Prime Minister while the incumbent is overseas. Rival political parties are soon banned. An eloquent orator, many were struck by his easygoing style.
When if you drive around Grenada, you see the most...
Dr. Terry Marichaux, now a general practitioner in Grenada, volunteered to be Bishop's bodyguard.
Oh, Bishop was a down-to-earth, charismatic, a person who loved this country, a patriot, somebody who was willing to give his life for his country.
In all of the other areas.
And it wasn't just many Grenadians that were impressed by Bishop's charm. He'd also caught the attention of Cuban President Fidel Castro, who later said, "The US government despised Grenada and it hated Bishop. Bishop was not an extremist, although yes, he was a true revolutionary, conscientious and honest. Never could we disagree with his intelligent and realistic policies." As well as offering his support to Bishop, Castro was quick to send hundreds of Cuban advisors and technicians to Grenada. Amongst them was Irma Veitia. In her 20s, she was asked to leave her native Havana and go to Grenada as an English language translator.
I was one of the many lucky Cubans who were assigned to different missions in Grenada. So I was a translator for the Cuban personnel at the beginning, and then I was assigned to work as a translator at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the government of Grenada.
The new airport will have a 9,000...
The most high-profile project the Cubans were involved in was the funding and construction of this airport.
But the problem was that they did not have airports prepared to receive big planes and, thousands of tourists a year and that kind of thing. So the Cuban contingent was working in the construction of a new airport, an international airport, to the south of the island. That was at Point Salines.
Cargo planes and for jets.
As work continued, the United States began to worry. President Reagan saw this not as a project to boost tourism. He viewed it as a threat to regional security.
At the southern end of the Caribbean chain, the Cubans, with Soviet financing and backing, are in the process of building an airfield with a 10,000-foot runway. Grenada doesn't even have an air force.
Reagan also justified threatening military action by the fact that there was a medical school with 700 American students right at the end of the runway. Whether it was the threats from Reagan or the pressure of power in Grenada, the political situation began to worsen. An estimated 3,000 opponents of Bishop were at some stage detained without trial. Amongst them was Winston White, a former minister in the pre-revolutionary government. He had known Bishop since childhood.
I had no doubt in my mind at all where he was leading us to.
Which was?
Into the Soviet camp. I had no doubt about that. Castro was just a midway stop. It was on to Moscow, we were bound.
White spent over 4 years inside Grenada's notorious Richmond Hill prison. He prayed for outside help.
Well, we, of course, in the dungeons up at Richmond Hill, were praying day and night that President Reagan would, in fact, do something. Let not this be only talk. Because there was no way that there were no signals of us coming out up there.
Complaints about mass torture.
But then there was an unexpected twist to the revolution. Bitter infighting broke out within the ruling party. After a tumultuous few days, Maurice Bishop and several of his ministers were executed here at what was then the Revolutionary Army headquarters. Callistus Bernard led the firing squad which killed Bishop. He served 27 years in prison for his crime and was released in 2009. He had not visited this place since. Bernard does not attempt to justify his actions, but he says that inexperience and international pressure took the revolution he had passionately supported towards a precipice.
What happened with revolution, you have a lot of power concentrated in your hands. You have, you don't have no checks and balances. And anybody needs checks and balances.
Despite being an admirer of Cuba, he is critical of its involvement.
But what happened now in power now, the Cubans in a sense, took sides. Their model is that you had to have a man on top, a maximum leader, right? And everybody else had to follow in line with him. That was their genuine model, because that's the model they have of Fidel. He is the maximum leader, and he wanted to impose that on Grenada.
A nearly defenseless people in a region of great strategic importance to the free world.
Reagan, meanwhile, saw the chaos in Grenada as both an incentive and an opportunity to act.
United States paratroopers have invaded Grenada with helicopter gunships. Our armed forces are engaging them in fierce battle. All Grenadians report immediately to our respective militia bases. All doctors, nurses, and medics report to the hospital immediately.
On the 25th of October, Operation Urgent Fury was launched. Army Ranger Robert Ross, then based in Savannah, Georgia, had no idea where Grenada was when the call came in.
Never heard of the place before. I remember they called us in on alert on a Sunday morning. And when I got there, they said, okay, this is the real deal. We're going into Grenada. I was like, what?
In one sign of a lack of preparedness, the American invaders had no military charts of the island. They adapted tourist maps.
This is the point where we had a fighting position set up here, and there was guys across the street, the runway here, firing at us. And the only way to get across the runway, we found a bulldozer. We straight wired the bulldozer, and we put Sergeant Bowles on it. Everybody got behind the bulldozer and fought across the runway up the hill to take on the enemy.
So who was the enemy? Were you fighting Grenadians or Cubans?
Both. We was fighting Grenadians and Cubans. A lot of the people that was part of the resistance.
Irma Vatia watched it all unfold.
Well, we Cubans had a meeting the day before the invasion. There was no doubt that the Americans would come and, invade the island. And when we went out, we were able to see that the helicopters were already dropping the parachuters, and they were occupying the area where the Cuban workers were building the runway of the future, what could be the airport. We responded to the attack, but we had no means to really fight against that invasion. We needed weapons, but powerful weapons, you know. They had ships, the helicopters, the 82nd Airborne Division, you know. So there were a handful of Cubans with a few rifles.
This complex looked like a large storage and
the American military says it did face heavily armed resistance and during the invasion discovered a large hoard of weapons.
Over this hill, we found a warehouse that contained over 110,000 weapons, which the island, as I remember, had a population of 110,000 people. There was enough weapons that was found that could give every man, woman, and child a weapon.
The invasion was condemned with a large majority by the UN General Assembly as a flagrant violation of international law. And British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was apparently furious that her close ally Ronald Reagan had not warned her of his plan to invade a country which was still a member of the British Commonwealth. The President had to make an excruciatingly difficult phone call.
Hello, Margaret Thatcher.
If I were there, Margaret, I'd throw my hat in the door before I came in. Listen, we regret very much the embarrassment that's been caused you, and I'd just like to tell you what the story is from our end out here. I was awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning, supposedly on a golfing vacation down in Georgia, and was there with the Secretary of State, and so we met in pajamas out in the living room of our suite to, because of this this urgent plea from the Organization of East Caribbean States, pleading with us to support them in this thing in Grenada. When your word came with your concerns, by the time I got it, the 0 hour had passed and our forces were on their way.
45 Grenadians, 25 Cubans and 19 Americans were killed during the US intervention. At a speech honouring the Cubans that died, Fidel Castro criticised the coup that had ousted Bishop, but said the decision to try to help Grenada repel the US invasion was the right one. Cuba, he said, was placed in a morally complex and difficult situation. Under these conditions, he explained, we, under no circumstances, could abandon the country. If imperialism really intended to attack Grenada, our duty was to remain there. To withdraw at that moment would have been dishonourable and could even have stimulated the aggression, now in Grenada and tomorrow in Cuba. Winston White, meanwhile, was in prison when he heard the commotion surrounding the US invasion. How did he react?
Gleefully, because then you knew what liberation time had come.
But what about people who say that this is an act of the big imperialist kind of taking over the island?
Nonsense, nonsense, nonsense. No, absolute nonsense. I mean, they should have been inside there, then they would have been happy that the big imperialist came.
In a nearby cell was Tillman Thomas, who would later become Prime Minister of Grenada.
I mean, the Prime Minister was executed, several of his cabinet ministers were executed, the whole nation, island was under house arrest. You know, people couldn't come out to get basic necessities for a few days. I mean, so there was need for some form of intervention to restore democratic rights and to restore institutions. It was like anarchy.
Like all the other Cubans on the island, Irma was rounded up by the American soldiers.
Well, after 1 week at what they call the concentration camp in Point Salines, we returned to Cuba. First of all, they line up all the personnel, all the women first, and then the rest of the personnel. And they said, on the march, and we walked and walked, but we didn't know where they were taking us. And finally, we stopped at a certain point. After an hour walking around the island, we stopped at a certain point, and they told us that we had to wait there. Then the International Red Cross came with some transportation, and they took us to the old airport in Grenada, and there we boarded a plane that brought us back to Cuba.
41 years after the invasion, few physical reminders remain, and most of the scars of that divisive time have also healed.
Grenada, island of spice.
In 2009, the airport was officially named after Maurice Bishop. Tillman Thomas, Prime Minister at the time, approved of the idea, even though he had been imprisoned by Bishop.
That project is really a project that people identify with the revolution. And if you have to name that after somebody, we feel that Bishop was the appropriate person.
Ironic, but I let it go because Fidel Castro really made a great contribution to the building of the airport.
Callistus Bernard, who admits being involved in the killing of Bishop and spent 5 years on death row, has more reason than most to believe in forgiveness.
We survived, right? And it's our obligation now to really, do as much as we could to really promote healing and reconciliation, because these were terrible events, these were terrible times.
Irma Veitia, meanwhile, who in 1983 left Grenada in handcuffs, recently returned.
To my surprise, to my delight, I found a different Grenada. The country has developed a lot. Tourism is the main industry at the moment. Some of those people who studied here in Cuba many years ago are now in leading positions in different sectors of the government and the country as such.
There are some who suggest that while the US might have won the battle here, they didn't necessarily win the war. Maurice Bishop's former bodyguard points out that despite being expelled, the Cubans soon returned.
They still came back and built a hospital for us. They still send many of their professionals to work in our hospitals and to work in all different fields in Grenada. And they're still very welcome in Grenada because people see them as genuine friends of the Grenadian people who are always willing and ready to help. You compare that to the United States, which was the invading forces. But what have they done for Grenada in 30 years? Literally nothing. There's nothing that you can point to as a monument that says, this is something that Americans built for us after the invasion that we can uphold as part of that love and cooperation between the United States and Grenada. In fact, the Chinese have come in and have done more than the United States. We have a brand new stadium that they built for us.
But plenty of others are grateful for the US invasion, which they see as preventing this small island from taking a path to disaster. Winston White here meets for the first time one of the men he says saved his life.
How you doing, my brother?
Man, I'm very good, thanks to you. I am alive.
I was a paratrooper, yes. I was number 5 to land on the island.
Number
5. I was the 5th.
Number 5 is a secret number.
It's a secret number? Okay, it was for me, it worked.
What happened here had repercussions that went far beyond the shores of this small island nation. Many historians believe that the invasion of Grenada was a turning point for the foreign policies of both the United States and Cuba. For the US, the episode helped bury the ghost of Vietnam and convinced many in Washington that an interventionist foreign policy could be justified.
The world has changed. Today, our national security can be threatened in faraway places. It's up to all of us to be aware of the strategic importance of such places and to be able to identify them.
Cuba, meanwhile, in the years to follow, was arguably far more cautious about exporting or appearing to export its revolution. Since 1983, Grenada has maintained notably good relations with both the United States and Cuba. As those nations prepare to bury some of their differences and another chapter of the Cold War closes, perhaps they should look to this island as an example of reconciliation.